Hi everybody, welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. I'm Gary Tucker, and in the next 8 weeks we're going to be working on developing a motif, a single motif. Spending time with a single subject I feel is really important because it allows you to really understand your subject very well from a point of view of drawing, composition, color, edges, etc. This is the motif that I'm going to be working on over the next at least 4 or 5 weeks. Trinity Church in Boston, and this is the painting that I'm demoing today in our video. What I'm asking myself and my students to do is work on a single motif and work on this motif from a point of view of light, weather, season, and develop a series. This is the image that I'm working on. This church is very close to where I live, so I can see it on a regular basis, which helps me a lot because I can understand it through different seasons and certainly different lighting conditions. But my first step into this is to understand it from a point of view of shape, the shape that I want to project. And I'm showing you basically a two-value study here where I've isolated the profile. 3/4 view of the Trinity Church was my selection. As I'm going to be working on the church, I'm looking for a view that I feel is interesting, and the view straight on is interesting, but this 3/4 view I felt presented a more interesting feature. And I'm going to be developing this image and thinking about a center of interest. A center of interest, you've heard me talk about before, is an area in the painting that where we give a little focus and perhaps a little more energy. You can see it's a different distance from each side of the paper. So I've thought about the composition. I've thought about a good way to represent my subject, which is a building, and very often portrait painters and house portrait painters, they choose a 3/4 view because it represents a more interesting basic shape than, say, looking straight ahead at the house. One of the reasons for that is this strong oblique edge that I'm rendering in the pencil drawing. The strong oblique edge that basically creates a very dynamic energy in any painting. So I've laid out the drawing according to the shapes that I was thinking about. This is one of the first things that attracts me about any subject, whether it's a building, a landscape, a figure, anything, is the shape. And I'm rendering this with a single color, so you might appreciate the basic shape of the subject that I'm portraying. And it's a rather difficult to do when you're in the field, or even when you're working from an image, is to see your subject in terms of a simple shape. The reason is our vision is so developed, we can perceive nuance at a distance, we can perceive detail, we can perceive each of these windows in a single glance. It's harder for us to see the generalities, to see the basic shape, and especially with a complicated subject such as this church. So I'm using a yellow ochre and a little bit of burnt sienna to start off. Part of this is so that I get a feeling of the connection of these shapes and the similarities tonally as well. And practically what I'm doing is stating the lighter values where the sun is striking my subject to get an idea of the brightness that's generated and forming a connection between these two shapes, tree and church and foreground. 3 shapes, I should say. This is really helpful in seeing the simplicity, seeing the similarities in my subject, in my shapes. And I would say that's the first major step when you're in the field or when you're sketching, when you're getting ready to paint, is to see your subject from a point of view of shape and the similarities that you can create, that you can use to simplify your subject. That's what I've tried to do in the first application. The second application, I'm starting to create the light and the beautiful edges of my subject. And I'm doing this with a cobalt blue and a bit of neutral tint, also a little bit of alizarin. I don't want just a pure blue. I want to have a little variation to that blue. And some might say this is the negative shape, the shape that's generated as a result of the positive shapes. That could be, yeah, that's perfectly fine. But itself has a certain interest to the interlocking edges, and it's creating this oblique that I mentioned early on. It creates some very important energy, especially in the lower part of the building. It's a little difficult to do technically, this sort of wash, because you're cutting around the shape of the tree, you're cutting around the important aspects of the church itself, and you're doing this on an angle, so the color's flowing, it's moving, you're working with a little bit of speed because you want to be able to, I would like to be able to create a little interest in this wash, not just a flat wash, but a wash that changes as it comes down. So it's difficult when you're cutting around an object. Some artists, they use masking fluid. I don't like masking fluid because I can't measure my lights. When I mask out an area and I paint over it, I can no longer see the light, and that means I can't refer to it. So it's important for me to see the value relationship. How dark is this area against the light? That's the reason that I choose not to use masking fluid. But it makes the painting of it a little more difficult. It's not impossible, as you'll see. We manage it. So now we have that. If you remember that first study I showed you of the light against the dark, creating the simple shapes, we've presented that here, and we do have some nuance. But I find this stage to be really important, to be able to see and render your subject in terms of 2 or 3 simple shapes. I'm working into the shadow side of the building now, and this is a more difficult passage. I'm working on dry paper, but I want to keep a sort of fluidity and spontaneity in the stroke, and at the same time still capture the lights on the building, the lights on the spires, the temperature change within the shadow. There's a lot of things happening in this one wash. I want to get a nice graded wash. At the same time, I want it to function to define the building, and certainly to give me a feeling of intense light. So the intense dark is necessary for that. When we're working with a single motif, I'll say just a few words about that while video continues. We have a chance to really get to know our subject so well, in fact, that we can begin to perform it. I'll use the analogy, I've used this before, you might recognize it, of a musician who is given a sheet of music with notes on it, and over the course of weeks, months, memorizes this score, this music, to the point where they can perform it, they can execute it without looking at the sheet music anymore. In other words, they've internalized it. And we can do the same thing, and it's my feeling that it's a really good exercise and something that I engage in quite often. We can do the same thing with our visual motif. In this case, it's a complex motif, but I can paint it at this point without looking at the photograph anymore. And I can do that because I've done it a number of times. I've done tonal studies, I've drawn it in different weather conditions, I've gotten to know this view of the Trinity Church very well by exercising it a number of times. We can do that with any motif, and I think it really, as a way to progress yourself as a visual artist, doing that with a subject that you're close to, that you like, that you sort of, let's say it's your subject, is really important. And this has been going on for a long time in art history. One of the, I think, more prolific examples, better examples of this is Claude Monet, who took several subjects, but he really developed them over the course of his lifetime. If you look at his garden series or the series of the Seine, he developed these wonderful renditions in various lights, various types of weather, and they all project a different mood. And that's one of the things we're going to be practicing a lot in our series, is how to develop this concept of mood through visual expression. And it's kind of an intangible quality in painting. It's hard to point to any one thing in a painting and say this is where the mood is, and this is how the mood is generated. It's usually the result of a number of factors. And we're going to explore that over the next 8 weeks. How can we generate a specific mood? How can we amplify it or exaggerate it? How can we use watercolor specifically to help us in this goal of achieving a specific mood? One thing that is helping me to generate a bright, sunny, lively light in this painting is the use of edges. I'm using a lot of hard edges in this painting. Very sharp contrast, hard edges, someplace rough edges, to create the sharp contrast, the clarity in the light, the brilliance of a low light on my subject. And as I add the darker tones, I'm doing that more and more. And if you look at, remember the original photograph that I was using, there was no shadow across the foreground. I've added that as a way to drive the light towards the front of the building, also as a way to connect the darker passages in the painting so that they're not isolated, so there's a visual connection. You can see that shadow angles up to meet the shadow on the side of the building. The figures help in this respect also, the dark figures that I've placed. Right now they're a little indefinite, but as we refine the painting, they'll become more recognizable as figures. But yes, they're figures, but they're also a means to connect the darks in the painting so that they're not isolated, so that they're not, they hold the light together. Let's say that. They hold this light together when I place the strong connection, the darker connection. And I'm doing now the same thing on the right-hand side. For those of you that know Boston, this is the IMP building that is on the back side of Trinity Church. It's a very interesting square. If you're ever in Boston, it's probably one of the destinations you'll gravitate towards, because it's got some great examples of both modern and historic architecture. And so this is one of the reasons that I'm drawn to the area. I just love the context of new against old. I love the use of the material in both buildings. The IMP building is very, very luminous and reflective, whereas the Trinity Church is mostly stone, colored stone with ornate detail and indicative of the stone that's in the area. So there's a wonderful local reference in all of this. In any case, for me it serves as a motif that I feel I can really spend some time with, and will do so over the next several videos. So now you can see the high contrast is generating this sharp angled light on my subject. And as I said, there's a couple things contributing to that. The main one being tonal contrast, light against dark. Chiaroscuro is creating that brightly lit building. And I took some liberties. If you examine the photo, I didn't darken the turrets nearly as much as they should be. I'm going light on the colors of the stone. I'm keeping the tree itself almost as a plain shape until the end, when I add a bit of coloring to make it feel a little rounder. And as these washes dry, they'll become more luminous also. They seem very stark and plain right now, but as they dry, you'll see more subtle variations. This is sort of the aspect of watercolor that can give us problems, because when you put down a wash, it looks one way. As it dries, it looks another. So we have to anticipate this change and work with it. I'm making some adjustments now to that background building. Again, with the intention of making the front of the building, the face of the building, more luminous. Any sort of adjustment or addition that I add at this point is either to refer to the beauty of Trinity Church, and let's face it, we're painting an icon here, something that a lot of people recognize. So some of this detail works to that effect, but a lot of the detail, or a lot of the big washes, work to the effect of adding luminosity and driving the viewer's eye to my center of interest. In terms of mood, I feel this is one of the harder ones to represent. The scenario where we have a really strong, bright day with an abundance of hard edges. It seems to be a more difficult, not only technically, but in terms of our ability to edit, a harder mood to actually portray, at least for myself. And I'm more at ease doing rainy days, snowy days, twilight, low light, even nocturnes. This is easier for me. I feel there's maybe a little more leeway. In other words, we can get away with a little more when we're showing those types of lighting conditions and weather, whereas this one we have to be pretty precise. And so that's been the challenge in this painting, is creating that luminosity with precision and exaggerating some of the edges, some of the features of the church with simple brushstrokes. I'm not really manipulating my brushstrokes too much. I'm trying to state them clearly and accurately in the first go. And that's been the challenge here. As the painting is drying, you can see that shadow on the left is becoming more luminous, as is the upper part of the John Hancock building in the back. It's the building that I.M. Pei designed. And quite a history there. If you read about that particular time in Boston when this building was going up, they had a lot of challenges to make this building work physically, in terms of the engineering, in terms of the way it affected the local area. At this point, we need to add some smaller touches. I'm going to be working with the detail of the architecture, adding some smaller touches to the figures, and making them come out a little more from the shadows. A few highlights will do that. We could also place some local color into the clothing. Basically, these figures are necessary to give the building a certain scale. They're necessary to also, if you'll notice, I placed a figure on the lower right-hand edge, a couple of figures, to block the eye from traveling out of the painting. The same in the left-handed side of this angled shadow. I want to keep everything sort of centered and focused. So these figures are helping me in a variety of ways. I'm adding some of the color now to the tree. I feel the tree is a little flat. I'd like to have a bit more roundness to it. Also, I have to tone it down. It's just a little competitive with the lower part of the painting, so I'm adding a little burnt sienna, a little bit of yellow ochre, and so on to adjust. It's an adjustment that I'm making towards the end of the painting. It's dried pretty well, so I can add those colors without much worry of any bleeding. Well, here's the finished piece so far, the finished piece. And I feel I captured the light and that bright late day mood in Copley Square. A few figures mulling about. And so in the coming weeks you'll be seeing more and more of these renditions of Trinity Church in Copley Square. Okay, thank you very much.